Добре, благодаря. Дано като човечество имаме потенциала, щом сме причинили някакви кризи и да ги разрешим. Аз съм сигурен, че това е така, има някакъв природен баланс на силите, така че да продължим оптимистично напред. Благодаря още веднъж на господин Савов. И сега продължаваме напред с нашата програма. 10:30 е почти и по програма е презентацията на нашият лектор от Европейският орган по безопасност на храните, господин Горгиас Гарофалакис. Mr. Garofalakis, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Let me also switch on the video.
Okay. Can you hear us clear?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
Before you start your presentation, I would like to make some clarification. In case the public have any question, please ask them directly in English after Gorgias' presentation.
So thank you. Could I display the presentation? I can share my screen.
Yes, everything is ready. You can start.
Okay, perfect. So just a check. Can you see the screen as I'm screening?
Yes, the screen is visible.
Excellent, perfect. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, Chair, I would like to thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. It's an honor for me and for EFSA to take part in your event. Needless to say that I would have very much preferred to be physically there because in such meetings, scientific discussion is one thing, but networking and discussing with people, possibly over coffee during the break, is equally important sometimes. I'm here today to give you an overview, high-level overview, about the role that partnerships will have in the future strategy of EFSA, so in the strategy that will take us up to 2027. As I said, this is going to be a high-level thing, but I would be happy to address questions. Now, I believe that all of you are very familiar with the European Food Safety Authority, with EFSA. We are one of the several EU agencies. We are based in Italy. We're based in Parma, a small city in the north. The thing that you see there is our building. It can host, give or take, 500 people, and for the time being, it's mostly empty. And it's mostly empty because of the coronavirus and the measures are still in place. We are taking steps to go back to normality, but we are not quite there yet. This is sad, but also at the same time understandable. Another thing that perhaps I should flag, because it can be important when we are talking about risk assessment, is that EFSA has a remit for the food safety, for the protection of consumer health along the food chain, but we are also cooperating with other European agencies that have a neighboring remit, a close remit to EFSA. In particular, we're cooperating with the Medicines Agency, with EMA, with the Center for Disease Prevention and Control, that's the CDC, and with ECHA, which is the Chemicals Agency, especially when it comes to the safety of chemical substances in that particular case. Again, perhaps I will repeat things that you already know, but also I need to maintain a distance from the previous speaker who was very much talking about the way that risk management operates and the thinking that leads to decisions. So EFSA, by remit, has a mission on risk assessment and scientific communication. So production of scientific advice or risk assessment advice that goes to risk managers, that goes to policymakers, and also risk communication. Any risk management activity, such as policy making, drafting, or adopting legislation, enforcing legislation, all these are things that are done by the risk managers, which are the European Commission, the European Parliament, and of course, the authorities of the member states in the EU. With that being said, I intend to shift slowly to the strategy of EFSA 2027, but before that, I think it would be worth to have a very quick look at the drivers, at the forces that made us think of what we should change in our approach in the future. And these, if I can say, have mainly been three things. The first one is the need to be as responsive as possible to the needs of risk managers, policymakers, but also society. And by response, I mean the ability to provide fit-for-purpose scientific advice that can solve health challenges that have to do with food, but also support policy implementation. The Green Deal has been an ambitious set of policies, set of strategies. They make specific mention to a sustainability status of the food system, and this, of course, will need the support of scientists, scientific advice at the background. Then I also mentioned society, and society has a very wide range of requirements, I believe, from institutions such as EFSA. And similar things apply, I believe, to competent authorities in the member states. They want us, yes, they do want us to provide scientific advice which is fit for purpose. That is true. They have their own priorities when it comes to food safety, but they also have the feeling that they would like to be not just informed, but sometimes participate there. They need to have the feeling and also the possibility to participate in consultations, to voice concerns. And this is something which is closely associated not just with a society need, but also with a quality which is very important for EFSA, but also for the competent authorities in the member states, which is trust. They need to be able to inspire trust to the public and also maintain this trust. And certain values and certain policies that we apply with regards to, for instance, accountability or transparency are essential in that respect. Another driving force for us has been complexity, and I'm talking here about scientific complexity. The questions that we are being asked, the mandates that we are receiving, are becoming increasingly complex as new data and new science becomes available, as new applications, new innovative applications come to market. All those are things that force us increasingly to follow more complex approaches, of course, work in a multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary way with many different people, with experts that cover a broad spectrum of expertise, etc. So addressing complexity has been a concern and a major driver for our change in the coming years. The third one that I've singled out here is an opportunity that we see, and that is the opportunity that the ecosystem, and by ecosystem here I mean the actors, societal or other, that are beyond the usual community of risk assessors. So I'm talking about industry, for instance. I'm talking about citizen scientists or scientists that happen to work in different fields, perhaps far away from food safety. I'm also talking about organizations that are active on food safety matters, but they are beyond the EU. So we came up with a question: how can we be inclusive so that we can take advantage of this power and of this knowledge and bring it closer to us, perhaps also giving something back in order to advance, in order to meet our mission successfully. So these have been things that really inspired us and sort of stimulated our thinking for the new strategy. Now, our new strategy, and I will not focus on the details, I will keep it at a very high level. In terms of strategic objectives, it's simple. It has three top strategic objectives. The first one, it's what we call our core business, is the mission that we have to provide fit for purpose and trusted scientific advice and communicate this advice on the risks along the food chain from farm to fork. So this is core business for risk assessment and risk communication. The second strategic objective has to do with preparedness. Preparedness for whatever needs the risk analysis system, which comprises of risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication, will have in the future. I understand that this may be a little bit cryptic, but I will say a few more words on that in the next slide. And the third one is an internal objective, and it has to do with the need for our institution, for our organization, to have the internal capacity to mobilize the people and the resources in order to succeed in the first two strategic objectives. Specifically about the preparedness, I think it's very useful that we have that as a strategic objective, because in Europe we have seen a series, luckily not very often, but a series of crises. And for every crisis, we understand that we need to take steps in order to make sure that the next crisis is avoided, if possible, so never seen, or if seen, manageable as much as possible. So when we are talking about preparedness, we bring in mind a number of things. The first one is the realization that there are many people in Europe, very knowledgeable people and capable people that are working on risk assessment in the member states. So we need to make sure that we all work with, let's say, a common risk assessment culture in the EU, that we have the will and also the possibility to cooperate to address scientific problems as they emerge. Then we need to take special care of crisis preparedness. And one way to do that is to keep an eye on emerging risks. And I think that the previous speaker also devoted a fair amount of time to also stress the need to identify emerging risks as soon as possible. The capacity for us to develop guidance and scientific methodologies in order to assess future risks, in order to provide the scientific advice in the future is also important. And in general, preparedness for whatever developments in the regulatory system we're going to have. Data and analytics get their own bullet point here because we are in the age of data, of big data. So for us to have the ability to make use of it and understand and make sense of it using analytics, using big data effectively, it's also marked as a challenge for us. Let me introduce the term partnerships here, at least for this beginning of the presentation. So partnerships, and by partnerships I mean for the time being cooperation, it's something that we see as important, let me correct that, as essential for achieving our mission in all three objectives. So for the delivery of what we call the core business, the risk assessment advice and risk communication, we see a lot of potential to work with trusted, with reliable, with knowledgeable partners in the member states in order to deliver the scientific advice, to produce the scientific opinions. But also there is a huge potential when it comes to being prepared for the future. So also strategic objective 2 can be strongly supported by partnerships. We also see possibilities in the third one, which, as I mentioned before, is an internal one. So we see that there is possibility to, let's say, adopt best practices or adopt technologies or even use services from other organizations if those services fit in our needs and can help us do our work in a better way, in a more efficient way there. A reasonable question at this point would be, how will these partnerships operate? Are we talking about projects or are we talking about something else? And the answer to that is mixed. However, the way that we are going to start is build on what we have now. And you're very, very aware that EFSA is having the liberty to launch projects which are implemented by organizations in the member states. So this trend will continue. So the vast majority of partnership collaboration will take place in the form of big projects, ambitious projects. And they will operate in the schematic fashion that I see here. This is nothing complicated. What EFSA will be doing is trying to frame the scientific need in a way that a partnership, an organization or a consortium of an organization can work on it and provide feedback which will be utilized to produce a scientific opinion. And all those partnerships will not be operating, of course, in vacuum, will not be operating in isolation. We will have to invest, and we are investing in digital platforms. That is, platforms that allow the communication, the sharing of knowledge across this community, and of course, between EFSA and the partners that support our work. We will have networking and cooperation mechanisms. We will have to invest even more, I believe, in capacity building, because this is the element that will ensure that knowledge will flow and will be able to move from the place that is produced to the place where it's needed, from the place that it will have to be applied. And of course, I mentioned networking, important for it to take place in the EU, even more than it is now, I believe, but also important to have links or to be able to establish links with good organizations beyond the borders of the European Union. I've also added in the slide perhaps an underlying activity as well, very important for us because, as I mentioned, establishing a many trust is important. This constant process of communicating, discussing, exchanging views with consumers, with other stakeholders, like, for instance, the industry or the wider academic community or any other interested party. Again, an activity which is at the background, but also very important in order to achieve our mission. I have not given a definition on partnerships, and that is to avoid confusion with the actual meaning of the word. But let me try and describe it in a qualitative way. So now we do have scientific cooperation with many organizations in the member states, many competent authorities. We can call that the usual cooperation. It tends to be project-based, it tends to be ad hoc, it tends to be very transactional. So we want a small little thing, we get a small little thing. The ambition, the vision here is to be able to evolve that to something which is bigger, bigger perhaps in size of investment, but also bigger in size of engagement, in size of cooperation with the parties. Of course, such partnerships, such levels of cooperation can only be achieved if we are talking about a relationship which is win-win. It's based on mutual interests, so strong interests. Ideally, something which is reciprocal. So something is needed, but also something can be provided with lots of margin for co-creation on the basis of shared values. And of course, when we are talking about that intensity of cooperation, we don't necessarily have only shared benefits, but to some extent also shared risks. And that implies a kind of shared strategy between EFSA and the organizations in the member states, or at least aligned strategy to some aspects, because a fully shared strategy may not be feasible in the years to come. We are not there yet. We are trying to develop our thinking, our approach there, and it's clear for us that we will need three things. We will need to explore and identify what the win-win is. So what is the common interest with the different organizations? And of course, we do understand that different organizations have different views. It's not all the same. We need, and we are working to improve our cooperation mechanism to make it more compatible from the administrative point of view with the organizations that we would like to cooperate with. And the third one is a little bit of an internal cuisine. We are looking to ways that we can improve our outsourcing approach so that the needs that we advertise through our processes for grants and procurement are also presented in a very friendly manner to the interested parties in the member states. How do we do that? We have two lines of work. One has to do with a discussion with the member states. This is taking place mostly at the level of the advisory forum. And then we have an internal group of good colleagues that are looking at the structure of our outsourcing system, and they're trying to propose ways to improve it. So we have an internal sourcing task force, as we call it. And those two work in tandem, and we believe this work will take us a few more months, and perhaps we conclude it with proposals within the next year. One thing here to also mention a few words about the ecosystem, but also the problem of partnerships the way we see it. We think that if we break it down to the basics, the challenge of partnerships that we have is easily addressed if we have three things. And those things are networks of good, of knowledgeable organizations that can undertake pieces of the risk assessment work and provide their outputs to the work that we are doing. Experts, individual experts that can contribute their knowledge, they can put effort, they can join forces with EFSA, but also with the authorities and the organizations in the member states as well, that can bring the knowledge and apply it where it is needed. And the third one is knowledge itself. So we need a kind of a fabric of knowledge, again, that will enable us to push knowledge and also information and data where it's needed and where it needs to be applied. And that thing, that construction that I'm presenting to you in the slide needs to have the way to also at some point take advantage of the ecosystem. And by ecosystem, again, I remind you that I mean all the actors that are not in the risk assessment business, if I can say so, all the interested parties that are not directly cooperating with us. Of course, keeping in mind requirements such as the need to remain independent from third-party interests, etc. I will leave this here and perhaps go to more practical things, because another question is, okay, we have those mechanisms that will help us improve our approach with partners, but what have we done so far? So not so far ago, not so long in the past, I think it was last November, we launched a survey that was addressed to all Article 36 organizations, where we were asking a number of things. And those things included what is their view of EFSA, how tempting or how useful it is for them to cooperate with us, what blocking factors or what motives do they have in that. It was an effort for us to better understand how we can improve this relationship that we have with the individual now organizations in the member states. And this has been a very useful exercise, because one of the things that we highlighted is that although sometimes there is will, there is not a very good understanding even of simple administrative matters that have to do with our outsourcing mechanism, our grants mechanism, for instance. And the result is that we will need to improve there. We will try to invest in new training material, new infographics, dedicated events perhaps to explain how we work and how they can interact with us, but also things like the financing not linked to cost. This is a way to reimburse costs in our grant projects, and this allows us to dissociate the effort, to dissociate the actual cost from the contribution that we are giving. So the contribution can be related to the output rather than to the actual cost. And we think that this is a great step forward, because when we are talking about partnerships, estimating the actual cost can be tricky, and can be tricky when we shift across organizations, let alone countries. So this will provide, we believe, the a feeling of security in the minds of the potential parties that we will work with, that funding will not be a major challenge there. We have also started working on the content of the activities including in our future grants. For instance, we are thinking of the possibility to include activities that have to do with capacity building there, so to ensure that any new knowledge which is produced will be disseminated to the entire community. But also we are thinking about other things that will allow us to harmonize methodologies, which again will be essential for the operation of partnerships. We are also interested in looking at the other side of the equation, so to see what are initiatives in the member states that perhaps could be useful for the entire community. And by initiatives, I mean projects, I mean data collections or databases, things that have proven their value at member state level, but perhaps could be useful for the entire community. That would be extremely interesting. That is something that we have not explored yet in detail, and we would like to look at it much closer. We have some examples of community initiatives that were adopted by EFSA, but these are very few so far. Of course, another necessary thing is to make sure that whatever we open for participation is very visible in the community, that information is readily available, and it is a form that can be understood and disseminated. One of the practical things that we have adopted for the first time this year is the fact that we will give an overview of the envisaged calls for grant procurement with a 2-year horizon. We've done, as I said, the exercise this year for the first time. It's not perfect. We have a lot of projects that we know the area, but we don't know the title yet. So we have not exactly reached perfection there. But as I said, it's something that we will work on. Speaking of which, there is a webinar scheduled for the 16th of November. And the aim of that webinar would be to expose to interested parties what risk assessment recurring needs, as we call them, will be opened for cooperation, for partnership in the coming year in 2022. And of course, an essential element in this effort is the focal points. So we will invest more in the focal points. We see them as the most important tool to achieve this networking potential and this binding element, which is very much needed in the member states, so as to build partnerships, but also maintain them, achieving this long-term perspective that we would like them to have. Doing some little advertisement here, a bit gray advertising here. Today, it is the starting day of the 81st Advisory Forum meeting. It's running in parallel to this conference, but the Advisory Forum meeting will also continue tomorrow. And tomorrow, We will be having a 2-hour discussion with all the advisory forum members, with the representatives of the member states, which will touch upon some of the elements of the partnerships. So we will have a part which will look at the actual engagement opportunities, that is the envisaged calls for grant and procurement that we are having, and we'll also provide there some information. We will remind some information about how our outsourcing mechanism operates, but we will also have a discussion, hopefully a very vivid discussion, about how we can do knowledge sharing better, using, of course, digital ecosystems and platforms. And the ambition here is to understand two things. One is, what kind of needs do the organizations and the member state have? For instance, and when I'm talking about needs, I'm talking about the need to identify, for instance, elements of a risk assessment work, not the entire opinion necessarily, or the possibility to provide input on very specific things instead of a big chunk of work, but also to see if there are technologies, if there are outputs that are readily available and perhaps the member states or the organizations of the member states would like to share with the community or to develop further within the community. Myself, I'm really looking forward to the discussion tomorrow, and I think that it will be very useful for us and also the colleagues in the member states to actually see what the best course will be in the next coming months. I mentioned grants, envisaged grants and procurement, and this painting, if I can say so, this very colorful graph shows the high-level areas that we plan to invest within the next 2 years. We cover a very wide range of topics, and I need to stress that the titles that you see there are very high level. For example, you see artificial intelligence, but there are topics in that area that are in essence toxicology, assisted by machine learning and artificial intelligence approaches. So this is only a high level overview. But one thing that I would like to stress is that there are two relatively big gray boxes here. One is titled Other, and another one is titled Recurring Needs. And they're gray because we have not been able to, at least for the moment, we have not been able to see in detail what exact projects will be under there. We know the areas, we know the budget that we have set aside for it, but we don't know the titles yet. That is why we have not broken this down to the other boxes. Specifically, the box on the recurring needs, the ambition there is to try and entrust big parts of the risk assessment process when it comes to things like regulated products. So dossiers, for instance, for the approval of enzymes, or a peer review of pesticides and active substances, or perhaps in the future food additives, etc. This is something which is starting as an effort from EFSA, and we are by no means mature. As I said, we're just starting the effort. The detailed list of grant and procurement calls, the envisaged ones, will be published in EFSA's website. I have the link at the downside of the slide. As far as I know, at least until yesterday, the new one was not published. It's still possible to find the old one. The new one will be published in the coming days, perhaps within next week, but I don't know the exact date yet. I think I can finish my presentation, perhaps taking a bit longer than anticipated, with a set of questions. I will not dive into the detail, but generally speaking, I would have two types of questions. The first one, the one in the gray box on the left, is questions about you, the participants, but also your organizations. What is your view of EFSA? Do you think that there would be a benefit of, let's say, strategic alignment between your organization strategy and EFSA strategy? But if you look also at a more personal level or at a group level, what would be the biggest motive, but also the biggest challenge to cooperate with EFSA? And this is a question that is very essential, because if we don't address the challenges, or if we do not at least try to mitigate them, then cooperation, let alone partnerships, will remain a challenge for the years to come. The box on the right is a little bit more strategic. It has a little bit more, if I can say, more philosophical questions, but also very important. So how can we all together, as a community, as a risk assessment system, if I can say so, how can we ensure that working together is the easy option, is the default choice that we have? How can we promote knowledge? Because as I said, it's the fabric, it's the binding element, and make sure that it circulates and it goes where it's needed without dedicating any specific effort for a specific cause. All these, again, are questions perhaps less urgent, I would say, but equally important in order to establish a new system better than the previous one. And with all this being said, I would like to thank you for your time and your patience and your attention. And as the chair said, I would be happy to address any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gorgias, to introducing us in detail to EFSA's cooperation strategy and the role of risk assessment. And now I give the microphone to Professor Georgiev, which is our Director of Risk Assessment Center of Bulgaria and also member of Management Board of EFSA, to comment this interesting topic.
Thank you, Gorgias, about the very nice presentation, which is illustrated the new approach of EFSA new strategy. I will prefer to continue in Bulgarian now. We have the translation in both directions, so you should have the translation from the Bulgarian translator. Той лято, в отговор на тази нова стратегия от коопериране към партньорство, която ще въвежда ЕФСА в 5 години, съгласно стратегическия план. Само на английски. Нямаме двупосочен. Кой не ме разбира? Нямаме ли превод? Both side translation in English. I should speak in English, no problem. The problem is that this summary was the very first attempt to apply this new strategy of EFSA, working with the member states from cooperation to partnerships. And this procurement for outsourcing of activities to the countries, Bulgaria has the possibility to introduce here the new activities according to prevention of the African swine fever strategy, how we should work in the future together with the African swine virus. It's very similar now and connected with the situation now with the COVID in Europe. We should live together with virus and should learn how to rule, how to move the virus under control. We need to have such campaigns, not only for the risks of animal health, but the risk in the food chain control and some food outbreaks, foodborne diseases, and residues, pesticides, and contaminations of the food. For that, these activities are very important to involve the more scientific organizations from countries to work actively, and also to obtain some incomes for their staff for such activities. This is a new approach that we are congratulate and we encourage to do in the next 4 or 5 years during this plan of and strategy of EFSA. So this is a very nice example how we are doing this summer. Thank you, Georgie, about your presentation. I wish you success also, and maybe we should meet us in December of the meeting of management board physically in premises of EFSA in Parma. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Georgiev.